Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision. It's almost like engineering.
Right, yeah, like a broken arm.
Exactly. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at it and says, well, there it is.
It's binary, broken or not broken, it's clean. And frankly, it's comforting. We like things to be visible and easily categorized.
But then you step into the world of neurodevelopment trauma, or in our case today, the psychological transition to parenthood. And suddenly that x-ray machine is just completely useless.
Oh, yeah. You're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky.
Right. So today on the deep dive, we're taking your maternal newborn nursing material, specifically Chapter 13, the transition to parenthood, and we're extracting the exact clinical markers you need to navigate these muddy waters.
Because you really need concrete tools for this.
You do. This is a special last-minute lecture deep dive tailored specifically for you, the nursing student gearing up to your exams and your next clinical rotation. We're focusing entirely on the mind, the emotions, and the family unit.
And that application is just vital because the transition to parenthood, it isn't just a switch that flips the second a baby is born.
No, not at all.
It is a highly dynamic developmental process. It begins with the knowledge of pregnancy and continues for months postpartum. It's a time of extreme vulnerability. And as a nurse, understanding this transition is just as critical as checking vital signs.
Exactly. But before you can help a family adapt, you really have to understand how people even learn to be parents in the first place, right? Starting with the mother.
Right.
Clinically, the chapter breaks this down into intentional learning and intradental learning. Intentional learning is, well, it's obvious, formal instruction, the birthing classes, the thick parenting books.
But the reality is most individuals rely far more heavily on incidental learning.
Which is what exists.
So this is the passive absorption of the role. It's observing others, recalling how you were parented yourself, or even just internalizing how mothers and fathers are portrayed on TV or in culture.
It's sort of like starting a new job. Intentional learning is your employee handbook. But incidental learning is just sitting in the break room, watching how your coworkers actually act.
That's a great analogy, yeah.
But the problem is, what happens when the handbook expectations completely clash with the reality of, say, a screaming newborn at 3 a.m.?
Well, that's exactly where the transition fractures. And to understand how women navigate that psychological shock, clinical practice relies on two foundational frameworks.
Okay, let's get into those.
First is Ramona Mercer's 4 stages of becoming a mother. She emphasized that rewiring your entire identity takes time. It starts with commitment and preparation during pregnancy. Then, in the early weeks postpartum, there's an acquaintance phase where the mother is physically recovering while learning basic infant care. Slowly, she moves toward a new normal. And finally, she achieves a true maternal identity around 4 months postpartum.
4 months. That is such a vital timeline to lock in for your exams because it reminds us not to expect instant perfection.
Exactly. But Mercer actually built her work on an older, very famous framework by Reba Rubin, which maps out the immediate postpartum period.
Oh, right, the maternal phases. This is a massive focus for nursing students.
Huge. Rubin defined 3 phases. Phase 1 is the taking in phase, which hits in the first 24 to 48 hours. During this time, the woman is entirely focused on her own personal comfort and physical survival.
She's basically in survival mode.
Totally. She is highly dependent on others for her immediate needs and has a significantly decreased ability to make decisions. She'll also constantly want to talk about and relive the birth experience.
And we shouldn't just memorize that. We need to understand the why behind it. Her brain is literally trying to process the massive adrenaline crash, the physical tissue trauma, and just the sheer exhaustion of labor.
Right. Her body is screaming for recovery.
So, okay, let's unpack this critical component box from the chapter. How does a nurse actually use the taking in phase clinically?
It directly dictates your nursing actions. Because her brain is forcing her into a dependent state, the nurse must be heavily directive.
A directive meaning you don't give her a ton of choices.
Exactly. You don't walk in and ask open-ended questions like, would you like to take a shower now? Or do you want to try changing the diaper? You say, I am going to help you to the shower now. Or you initiate the diaper change and gently guide her hands to assist.
You're carrying the cognitive load for her.
Yes. Then, after that initial shock wears off, usually after a few days, we move into the taking hold phase, which can last for weeks.
And that's when she shifts her focus from her own healing to the infant, right?
Exactly. She becomes more independent and is super eager to learn. But because she's taking on so much, she can easily feel overwhelmed or inadequate.
Which makes the taking hold phase the absolute golden window for postpartum teaching.
It really is. Once she has mastered that, she eventually enters the letting go phase. This is a period of grieving and restructuring. She has to let go of her old pre-baby relationship behaviors, give up the fantasy of what the baby could have been, and accept the reality of the child as they really are.
Wow. Because the maternal role is so physically consuming early on, it's incredibly easy to overlook the partner. But family dynamics require a wider lens.
They absolutely do. We have to look at fatherhood because men's preparation is vastly different. Generally speaking, men don't heavily role-play parenting during childhood like women often do.
Right.
During pregnancy, a man is often mentally evaluating how he was fathered to figure out what kind of father he wants to be. And this leads to a really incredible phenomenon researchers call engrossment.
Yes. Here's where it gets really interesting. Engrossment is described almost like a hypnotic trance, visually and tactilely obsessing over the baby's features.
Yeah, neurologically, they're getting a huge dopamine hit. They perceive the infant as absolutely perfect.
But society often treats dads as secondary helpers rather than primary bonders. So how does nursing care shift to actually validate this trance?
You validate it by deliberately bringing the father into the spotlight. You encourage early skin-to-skin physical contact. You vocally praise his interactions with the infant, which reinforces that dopamine loop and builds his confidence.
Because his involvement is hugely influenced by whether his partner actually expects him to be involved, right?
Exactly. You have to facilitate those discussions.
And as we look at who makes up the modern family, we have to recognize that friction points change based on demographics. Take adolescent parents, for example.
Oh, that is a group facing immense compounding pressure. You are watching two distinct developmental stages just collide.
Right. They're teenagers and parents at the same time.
Exactly. They're actively navigating the friction of being a teenager, figuring out their own identity, while suddenly having to take on the entirely selfless responsibilities of a parent.
So your nursing priority has to shift. You present information at an age-appropriate level, but crucially, you explicitly include the adolescent father in all teaching so he doesn't feel marginalized.
And practically speaking, you must include the maternal grandparents in your teaching sessions.
Because they're probably going to be the primary support, right?
Yeah, realistically, the teen mother is likely returning to her parents' home. Those grandparents need a firm refresher on current evidence-based infant care practices, like safe sleep, which have changed drastically since they were parents.
So true. Now, adolescent parents face the friction of their developmental age. But for the growing demographic of same-sex parents, keeping in mind the increasing number of LGBTQ millennials having kids, the dynamics are entirely different.
They are. And clinical research highlights some unique strengths here. Lesbian couples, for instance, often report less parental stress and social isolation compared to heterosexual couples.
Wait, really? Less stress?
Yeah. It's largely because their partnerships tend to be highly egalitarian. They naturally share the workload and infant care more equally.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. But they do face specific societal friction, like the non-birthing mother feeling invisible in the healthcare system. Which brings up the safe and effective nursing care box in the chapter regarding the induction of lactation.
Yes, this is so important. It's highly common for both mothers in a lesbian relationship to want to breastfeed their infant.
So the non-birthing mother can also breastfeed.
Absolutely. The nurse's job is to proactively ask both mothers if they plan to breastfeed. You don't wait for them to bring it up. If the non-birthing mother wishes to nurse, you can provide specialized support.
Using hormonal therapy and pumping.
Right, exactly. Hormones trick the body into thinking it's pregnant, combined with pumping started months before the birth. They can also use at-breast supplementation. It deeply supports their egalitarian co-parenting goals.
Okay, so we know who makes up the family. Now we need to look at the exact physical and emotional mechanisms of how they connect with the newborn. For your exams, you must know the difference between bonding and attachment.
This is a massive nursing exam distinction. They are entirely distinct concepts.
Break it down for us.
Bonding is the initial emotional attraction that begins during pregnancy or shortly after birth. It is strictly unidirectional.
Unidirectional, so it just flows one way.
Right, from the parent to the infant. It's the parent calling the baby by name, kissing them, cuddling them.
Okay, so if bonding is a one-way street, attachment is bidirectional.
Exactly. Attachment is an emotional connection that forms over time through a reciprocal loop. The infant cries, indicating a need, the parent responds with comfort, and the infant responds by calming down.
And a huge part of initiating that loop involves maternal touch. Reba Rubin mapped out the exact stages of this.
She did. It starts incredibly tentatively.
Right. The mother will first explore the infant using just her fingertips. Then, as she feels safer, she uses the palm of her hand to stroke the baby's head or body.
And finally, she pulls the infant fully into her arms, bringing the baby close to her body, usually in the and face position.
The and face position where they're face-to-face making direct eye contact.
And the physiology there is brilliant. When a mother holds a baby to her breast, the distance to the baby's face is about 8 to 12 inches. That happens to be the exact focal length of a newborn's eyes. They are literally designed to lock onto their parent's face at that distance.
Wow. But to really maximize that connection, parents have to understand how their baby is communicating back to them. Let's look at Table 13-3 on infant states.
Right. Clinical research breaks an infant's awareness down into 6 states: deep sleep, light sleep, drowsy, quiet alert, active alert, and crying.
So if I'm a nurse trying to teach a tired mom how to breastfeed, I shouldn't try it when the baby is in active alert and flailing around, right?
Definitely not. You are setting her up for failure. And you definitely shouldn't try when they are fully crying.
It seems like quiet alert is the golden window.
It is the absolute optimal time. During the quiet alert state, the infant's autonomic nervous system is stable, motor activity is minimal, and all their energy is diverted to visual and auditory processing.
So their eyes are wide and focused.
Exactly. When a nurse teaches parents to become cue sensitive to this state, it leads to synchrony events.
Which are those reciprocal, pleasurable interactions, like the baby grasping your finger.
Right. It completely empowers the parents.
But of course, bringing this new dynamic into an existing home introduces a whole new set of friction points, which brings us to family dynamics and sibling rivalry. We have to consider multiparous mothers having their second or third child.
You might assume a multipara is a pro who doesn't need as much psychological support. But Ramona Mercer found in 1979 that they carry profound guilt.
Because they worry about the older kids.
Yes. They constantly worry, will my other children feel abandoned? Do I have the emotional capacity to love another child as much as my first?
That guilt is so heavy. And pulling from the sibling adjustment box in the chapter, nurses can give concrete advice here.
Highly concrete.
You suggest taking older siblings on a special one-on-one outing, or have a present ready from the new baby to give to the older sibling at the hospital.
You can also let the older sibling physically climb into the hospital bed with mom, or teach the parents how to safely carry the new baby in a sling at home, which keeps their hands completely free for the older child.
It's all about mitigating displacement. Now, while all this family adjusting is happening, the mother's body is going through hormonal chaos. Estrogen and progesterone just fall off a cliff, which causes the postpartum blues.
It is vital to differentiate the baby blues from clinical postpartum depression for your exams. The blues affect the vast majority of women. It kicks in within a few days of birth and lasts for a week or two.
The woman might cry very easily and feel sad. But crucially, how do we distinguish it from depression?
Functionality. With the blues, she is still able to take care of herself and her infant. She might cry at a diaper commercial, but she's still feeding the baby.
Right. If she can't get out of bed or stop eating, that's a red flag for depression.
Precisely. So for the blues, your nursing intervention is education, intense reassurance, and advocating for maternal rest.
Okay, so we've covered standard psychological adjustments, but safe nursing care means adapting to every patient's unique physical reality. Let's look at parents with sensory impairments.
Treating parents with sensory impairments starts with the understanding that they have the exact same capacity to nurture their child, but you must modify how you deliver information.
Like with a visually impaired parent. You don't just say, the diapers are over there.
No, you orient them logically.
Yeah.
You describe food on a tray using a clock face like, your potatoes are at 2 both, and when assisting with ambulation, you use the sighted guide technique.
Or they hold your elbow, right?
Exactly. And for teaching infant care, like diapering, you don't lecture. You have them physically diaper the child while you verbally walk them through the steps.
What about hearing impaired parents?
Positioning is everything. Stand 6 to 8 feet away. Ensure the light is behind the parents, illuminating your face so they can read your lips.
Did you speak louder?
No, speak in a normal volume. Don't exaggerate your pronunciation because that distorts lip movements. And if using an interpreter, always speak directly to the patient. Never say, tell them to.
That directness builds so much trust. Now, to pull all of this together, let's look at the concept map and care plan for delayed bonding.
This is where clinical judgment really shines.
So what does this all mean in action? Let's say a mom had an unplanned 36-hour labor ending in a C-section. She's in acute pain, she's exhausted, and she's not responding to the infant's cries. How does the nurse intervene without adding guilt?
By looking at the root physiological cause, you can't force psychological attachment when the foundation of her physical survival is literally on fire.
Right, she's in surgical shock.
Exactly. The care plan dictates that you first treat the acute pain. You assess and medicate before you try to initiate any teaching.
And you cluster your care, right? Doing vitals and meds all at once so she gets uninterrupted sleep.
Yes. Use side-lying positions to avoid abdominal pressure. Once that acute pain and fatigue are managed, then you can provide gentle teaching on infant cues. You have to meet the physiological need to unlock the taking-in phase.
Which brings us full circle. So let's summarize the journey we just took. We went from understanding the internal phases of becoming a parent, like Ruben's taking-in phase, to adapting to diverse family structures.
We recognized the quiet, alert state for bonding.
And we implemented specific care plans for exhausted or impaired parents. To you, the nursing student listening, remember that the psychological care you provide during this postpartum period is the foundation for that child's lifelong emotional development.
It really is. Your empathy and directive care matter just as much as a clinical assessment.
Yeah.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to ponder. We talked about incidental learning, absorbing how to parent by watching others. But in today's world, new parents are doing their incidental learning through highly curated, perfect-looking social media feeds.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
How might that digital illusion alter Mercer's stages of achieving a maternal identity? And what new anxieties will you, as a future nurse, have to help them untangle?
That is a brilliant question to keep in the back of your mind. You're not just reading an X-ray. You're navigating the messy, beautiful reality of growing family. From all of us here at the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you so much for joining us on the deep dive today, and good luck on your upcoming exams.